So our first speaker is Tony Juniper. I've known Tony for very many years. Relatively recently appointed by Michael Gove, Chair of Natural England, but before that you will have known him in WWF. He worked for the Prince of Wales for a number of years, but also he was Chief Executive of Friends of the Earth for many years before that. Tony, let me ask you this question and set you off. You are hopefully going to be a major influence on how farmers are rewarded for their services to society, both environmental and otherwise, over the coming years. And there's every farmer in this room wants to know how you're going to make it possible for them to move towards net zero emissions and remain financially viable, or hopefully become even more financially viable for those that already are. So it's over to you.
Thanks very much, Patrick. It was a great pleasure to be here, first of all, and actually a wonderful pleasure to be part of what is a remarkable event with the Sustainable Food Trust and the National Farmers Union bringing us all together to discuss net zero carbon agriculture. I think as soon as 2 years ago, it wouldn't have been likely that such a thing would have happened. So I think the very fact that we're all here marks a big change in the quality of the discussion and the extent to which people now are getting onto the same page. And obviously, the fact that the level of awareness has risen is not the only thing that is now changing things in really quite fundamental ways. From our perspective at Natural England, one of the huge big things that's now out there is this change of policy intent away from general payments being spread around the country to this idea of public money for public goods. And this obviously is where a lot of activity now amongst my policy colleagues is now being focused in order that we can hopefully influence the discussion in a way that can make the most of this particular idea. And as Patrick said, we really are in the process of influencing the policy rather than writing it. The policy is being written by DEFRA, the government department. We're an advisory body to DEFRA, and so we're feeding in as much as we can in terms of how we can make the best of this opportunity that's now before us, and recognising that there's huge uncertainty around all of this at the same time. But the new policy tool is emerging, and obviously it's in the context of some other really big policy ideas that are out there. So one is the whole net zero idea, and the net bit of net zero, a lot of that is about land use, about forests and soils in particular. And alongside the net zero, we have the 25-year environment plan, the core idea in which is the recovery of nature within a generation, the recovery of wildlife populations, natural habitats, and ecosystems. And both of these ideas of net zero and the 25-year recovery of nature, both of these are against the backdrop of this notion of natural capital and the idea of seeing nature as bringing a whole load of valuable benefits to people rather than being something that gets in the way of economic growth, which unfortunately is where things were for quite a few years. So the idea of how we now move into this new space, using this new toolkit, the idea of public money for public goods is really one of the really big items on our agenda. The aim of this is, as far as I would characterise it, to work out how best we can incentivise agriculture to go low carbon at the same time as going high biodiversity, if you see what I mean. So we're not trading one against the other. Hopefully we can find ways we're going to be pursuing both of these things at the same time. And some of the things that would move into that space you can see fairly clearly. One, for example, is how we improve the quality of peatlands. They've been very important for biodiversity. They've been degraded over many decades and a big carbon impact as well as a biodiversity impact at the same time. And some of the ways in which peatlands have been damaged is through, for example, unsustainable sheep agriculture. So you can see a sweet spot right there, but there are many others scattered through the agricultural landscape in terms of where we now can begin to change behaviour in order that we can bend both of these curves in a different direction. So how this could go on the ground and in practice, this is something that's now taking up a lot of time and effort. We're helping with various tests and trials. Hopefully we'll be moving quite soon towards some pilot schemes that can begin to shed some experience as to how we might best do this. Just a few thoughts that are in my mind, and I know which are coming from my colleagues, is the need for example, to focus on outcomes. At the moment, quite a lot of the support that's offered to farmers in relation to the environmental side of things, it's a very formulaic approach based upon practice. It's quite bureaucratic, it's very specific, it doesn't have a lot of flexibility. Can we move beyond that to be focusing much more on outcomes rather than specific things that you might apply to lots of different farms? So there's some questions there about how we best do that. There are big questions about what public goods are we trying to incentivize. And I mentioned the two big ones, biodiversity and carbon, but how best do we refine those and measure them so that people can be given a clear idea of what outcomes we are looking for. And then there are quite a lot of issues in the design side about how we blend in private sector finance into this space so that government money is being used in order to stimulate more investment from other actors. And so one area that just seems to me to be already working in that space is the water industry and the extent to which we might be using public money for public goods in terms of reducing nutrient input into water courses, but to be doing that in partnership with a water company which has got a business interest there as well. So making more of the public money by levering in the private finance. And in some catchments, you might imagine that you'd be encouraging green farming with perhaps two buyers of ecosystem services in the catchment in the form of, for example, a company that wants to have a carbon offset at the same time as another company wishes to have clean water. So how do we make the public money for public goods tool work in that kind of context in a way where society is going to get maximum bang for its buck in terms of low carbon and high biodiversity? So these are some of the things we're looking at, and I'm afraid at the moment I can't tell you what the answer is because nobody's decided what it is, but an awful lot of effort is going in, and hopefully over the coming months we'll start to see some real flesh getting onto the bones.
So we had a prior agreement that I would interrogate Tony when he finished his opening remarks. So I want to ask you one or two questions. The first of which is, you'll know very well that there's a big debate about land sparing versus land sharing. And for those of you who don't understand that, a lot of the common agricultural policy support until now has been split between the so-called Pillar 1, which is just social security payments for farmers with few strings attached, and Pillar 2, which requires farmers to adopt environmental measures, which I would argue mostly around the edges of their otherwise unconstrained farmland. And there are two wings of this debate. There's the land sparers who say, well, we must spare land for nature, therefore that makes a justification for stewardship payments so that we can farm efficiently on the remaining land. And there's the land sharers who say, no, we should reward sustainable farming which can coexist with biodiversity protection in the same field on the main farmed area. Where do you stand on that?
I think, Patrick, it's a false choice. So I think we have to take a whole system view of this. And if you think about it just for a second in terms of the framing of that idea of land sparing or land sharing, it's predicated on the idea that we've got to have ever-rising yields, isn't it, really? Because, you know, if you look at that, you're basically saying, do we try to continue to push up the amount of food being produced, and do we do it in a way whereby we're really hammering an area, or we're going to use the whole landscape and take out the nature? That's the basic framing of it. And I would argue that if you take a whole system view of this, then the question is rather different. Because if you take the whole system view, you would ask yourself why we're putting 1/3 of the land in the bin, which is what 1/3 of waste food is. So you're already taking a load of land and wasting it in terms of food loss between the farm gate and the consumer. And so that, I think, is kind of obscured as an issue if you just take the sparing and sharing piece. There's a global obesity epidemic. We're not short of food in the sense of the amount of calories. And then there's another piece there about the amount of grain that's being fed to animals in cages. And if you start to look at all of that, you realise that actually we need to take a whole system view.
So I'd say you're making a land sharing argument.
I'm going to come now to the next bit in terms of whether, having made that point, whether it's sensible to split out the land into bits we're going to really hammer in order to get very high yields compared to bits we're going to maybe make wild in the most extreme characterization of this. And I would say that it's not either or, it has to be both as part of that systemic thinking. And the reason it has to be both is because if you don't do sustainable farming, it will by definition end. That's the definition of unsustainable, isn't it? It cannot be sustained. So you have to do both in order to be able to grow food, even on the land that is being targeted for the higher yielding crops, because you need pollinators, you need soil fertility, and you need climatic stability. And if you're not doing sustainable farming, you won't get any of those things.
But some of the farmers here have been farming quite intensively on the land that isn't in the stewardship thing.
Well, there we are.
And a question arises from that.
Yeah.
In a post-public money for public goods era, would those practices which still predominate at the moment be possible? In other words, could the farmer receive the public money for the public goods on part of the land, whilst on the other bit of the land continuing to use practices which may deliver public harm in one way or another? No fault to the farmer, but that's the issue, isn't it?
So, well, this is a big tension in the design of the scheme, in the extent to which, if you're after public goods, then do you get more public goods by targeting your finance into particular bits of the landscape and therefore not spreading your finance around as we presently do, either through the basic payment or the stewardship scheme? And so that's something that is there, which is being debated in terms of how best to strike that balance between spreading the finance everywhere compared to targeting where you get the big bang for the bucks.
Have you a view?
I think, there's two things. So the carbon can be spread very widely, I would say, in terms of the public benefit, raising soil organic matter. The biodiversity probably is more targeted into particular landscapes, is how my thinking is going at the moment.
Well, I don't want to pretend I have a view, of course, because I'm entirely neutral, so I'll back
yes.
off. What about rewilding?
So I would say that as we look towards the recovery of nature in England and the British Isles, and hopefully more broadly, we've got a toolkit which we use in different ways in different places. At one extreme of it is the complete removal of human intervention at a landscape scale in order for nature to regenerate itself. That can be a very powerful driver of biodiversity recovery, right through to highly managed habitats that for different reasons we would want to intervene in quite dramatically. And so hay meadows is a good example of that. If you stop mowing hay meadows, they stop being hay meadows, they become woodland. And so if you want to have that landscape feature and that biodiversity, you have to manage it. But in different parts of the country, you would use the toolkit differently, and in some places it's going to be a matter of choice of the people who manage the land. And hopefully what we can do, and at Natural England hopefully what we can do, is to advise people in the best possible way in terms of how we get the biggest outcomes for nature and carbon through people using the tools in the box in the best way for where they are. That's our role, I think.
Last question for this round.
Yeah.
Are you in favour of support? Richard Williamson just said, is soil a public good, or is it just an asset of the farmer? Are you in favour of rewarding farmers who build soil carbon?
Yes, I am. So there's two really big public goods that go beyond the land ownership of the farmer. So one is the amount of carbon that's in the soil and therefore not in the atmosphere. And so globally, there is twice as much soil carbon as there is vegetation carbon. And the higher we can keep that soil carbon, obviously the less is going to be in the air. That's a public good for everybody in the context of 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees. The other really big thing, which is linked with the quality of the soil, is water quality, of course. And one of the really big issues we face in this country is the effects of diffuse pollution, which in turn is linked to the ways in which we manage soils. And so, those two things go beyond the farm gate. They go beyond the field and therefore are of interest to the wider public. And actually, you could make an argument about the extent to which long-term food security is a public good. So if people trash their soils as a matter of personal choice in their own farm, because they don't care about 10 or 20 years' time, that will be of public interest in 10 or 20 years' time when we can't grow any food anymore there.
Well, thank you very much for those answers, and thank you very much for this intervention, but it won't be the last we hear from you, I'm certain of that.
Thanks very much, Patrick.
Thank you, Tony.
Thank you.
Now we're going to turn to the investment community. There's lots to talk about how money could drive change, and you talk about stranded assets, talk about sheltered, beneficial investment propositions, borrowing money, tax breaks, all sorts of things. But Rob has a lot of experience of the power of money to drive change, and he's involved with a sustainable farming project, and he's going to describe it to us. And I hope he's going to enlighten us as to the degree to which you feel that the power of the investment community can be a significant factor in moving all our food and farming systems towards the sort of goals we've been discussing today. So Rob Appleby, please welcome Rob.
Thank you, Patrick. I have to make an apology. I've lost my voice. So for those that can hear me, I'm sorry. And for those that can't, just wave your hand, because these guys will come and join you in a second. I'm Rob Appleby. I'm an investor and have been for 21 years. I'm also a philanthropist. I set up a philanthropy, a charity, 13 years ago, looking at environmental conservation. And the third thing is I'm a farmer, and for 17 years in West Dorset, I have been looking after beef cattle and have been wilding long before that fantastic book by Isabella Tree called Wilding. And it's really those specific interests that got me thinking about food and all the complexities about food. And 3 years ago, I started talking about this. I engaged a number of my friends to come and think about the challenges of food production. And I'd make one obvious observation. The first is that there are changing demographics. High population countries like China and India and sub-Saharan Africa are growing their middle class by virtually double in the next 10 to 15 years. And we have to think about what's driving that. One is the agrarian to urban migration, the changing dietary patterns going from a largely plant-based diet to an animal protein-based diet, typically in higher value foods. And really, as we think about food and feeding 9 billion people or 250,000 people tonight that weren't there yesterday, we really have to think about sustainable intensification. Now, I will touch on what that means. We set up a fund 2 years ago using institutional and individuals' capital to create a food fund. The strap line is more food with less, and it's all about sustainable agriculture and how we meet some of these challenges and embrace some of the complexity around the food value chain globally. Now, when we talk about sustainability, I won't repeat the points that have been discussed at a very high and intellectual level in the last day and a half, but I will say this. 10 years ago in China, and I've been living in Hong Kong for the last 20 years, there was no single definition for sustainability. The terms environment, social, and governance, ESG we call it, had no room in the debate. Today, ESG or sustainability is the highest risk in investing in China. Why? Because if you're polluting the air or the water, or you're pouring chemicals across fields or in rivers, the government will come in without notice at 3 o'clock in the morning and close you down. And if I'm an investor, either in equity or debt, my investment is then worth zero. It's not worth 10% less or 20% less, it's worth zero. So ESG has climbed the ladder and is now the most important thing that we think about when investing in and around these companies. The second and rather obvious point is sustainable companies are well-run companies. Well-run companies are worth more than badly run companies. And badly run companies are worth less. And this is not universally accepted. People think that because you're a sustainable, green, tree-hugging kind of guy, you're going to spend a ton of time and money and not get the returns that you could otherwise get. So I find that beyond belief, and I don't debate this issue anymore, but I do think that sustainability is value additive. And my mother was quite prescient when she said, listen, I love everything you're doing, but you really, you can't be in the red if you're trying to be green. And one of the things I'd like to tease out of this is the need to be both commercially sustainable as well as embracing all the other stuff, the ESG, that we have all debated today. I guess there's one other observation, and as Richard said in the last panel, there is no silver bullet. But as Yuval Noah Harari wrote in his book, Sapiens, which is a great book, and I think he's one of the world's best living thinkers, he said we're going through a second agricultural revolution. We might debate whether we're going the second or the sixth, but he said 12,000 years ago we went through the first agricultural revolution. That was when we went from hunter-gatherers to farmers. And we spent the last century embracing the Haber-Bosch process, using chemicals and fertilizers in a linear fashion to make higher yields. Higher inputs meant higher yields. And as we've talked about, and as people have noted, that linearity no longer stands. And we've got to start thinking about a circularity of the economy, and where waste is no longer a four-letter word, but it is a source of nutrients and is a source of energy. And on that basis, I will just give you two examples of investments that we have made. There are many, and I won't overstay my welcome here. And one is overfishing. The people that run our foundation said that we're harvesting 92 million tons of fish from the sea every year, half of which go to feed humans. And 2.6 billion humans rely primarily on fish as their primary source of protein. The other half is ground up into fish meal and provided to fish and to chickens and to pork, which I didn't know. And that is completely unsustainable. One, because the conversion ratio sits there. And two, these days, bycatch is no longer the guts that come out of a fish that you're filleting. We are going specifically using military ordnance to find trophic levels of fish. We go down 2.5 miles with nets the size of Wembley to take out the orange roughy to make fish meal. Give me a break. So we embarked on a journey to find out how we could disrupt the fish meal supply chain, providing nutrients for animal feed so that we could provide these higher value foods to this growing population. We looked at methanotrophic bacteria. These are bacteria naturally occurring at the bottom of ponds that feed on methane. Methane is a waste product. And in the course of 5 hours, these bugs eat methane. They double in size. You can harvest 20% an hour, and you can create a protein. And that protein has all the values of fish meal. It has a 91% protein content. It has all the essential and non-essential amino acids. It has the exact same conversion ratio in fish. We've looked at algae. We've looked at mushrooms. And we've looked at insects. Insects are extremely efficient converters. They use a fraction of the carbon footprint to produce 1 kilo of bug protein. And yesterday, I'm very proud to say that we opened the doors on the largest livestock business in the world, in Canada. We boast 6.5 billion American black soldier flies. And this was a construct which is 184,000 square feet, 36 foot high, trays that are 8 foot by 20. In those trays, stacked 14 rows high, is a fly Happy Meal made up of pre-consumer waste, broken biscuits, brewer's yeast, and so on. And 5 million neonates or eggs are put into these trays, and through an 18-day life cycle, those neonates go into larvae, go into pupae. They increase their body weight by 10,000 times. They are eating machines. And we're taking those pupae before they become adults. We crush them, and we're making fly protein. Right now, this doesn't go directly into the human food chain. This goes into fish and chickens and pork. But one day we'll be grinding this up and we'll be making fly or maggot flour, which will go into your pasta. I'm convinced. You heard it here first. If you look at commerciality, if you look at why we're doing this, one is this massive sustainability thing, and two, it makes commercial sense. I put up this factory for 34 million Canadian dollars. We're selling 20,000 tons of this protein each year for $3,000 a ton. And our payback on this factory is 2.5 years. So it makes all the sense in the world that we should roll this stuff out all over the world. Why doesn't everyone who's got a biscuit factory or a beer brewing factory have one of these things? Anyway, if we really are thinking about a circularity of the economy and taking the energy and the CO2 and the heat from these biodigesters or these combined heat and power sources, and thinking about how we can take that waste, utilize that waste, and put it back into the food system, we have to be thinking about sustainable intensification. And I'm talking about a situation where I was in New York 3 years ago, and I lifted the lid on this hamburger that I'd ordered, and there was this flaccid lettuce leaf. And I said, I wonder where this comes from. So I went on a forensic journey trying to find out where this lettuce leaf came from that I was eating in New York. And it turns out it comes from the Salinas Valley. And it's grown outdoors, and it uses water, and every single day of its life cycle, there's an inoculation for aphids, for nematodes, for insects. And it uses Mexican migrant labor to cut these. They stack it on trays. They put it on the back of a truck. They transfer it 6,000 miles to New York. By doing that, they waste 25% of their product. It takes 6 to 7 days, which means you've only got 4 to 5 days for that to be to have a shelf life. And if I looked at the carbon footprint, if I looked at all the inputs, this flaccid lettuce leaf is a Monsanto Happy Meal, and I'm not happy. So I looked at other ways of doing this, and I'll conclude with one of our investments, which is in AeroFarms. It's the most technically advanced vertical farm in the world. It's based in Newark, New Jersey, 8 miles from Times Square. It's taken an old steel mill, 84,000 square foot, and 16 rows high under LED lights, it grows leafy greens. It's 133 times more efficient than the field-grown equivalent. It uses no pesticides, it uses no herbicides, and it is cut mechanically and delivered to Whole Foods or to Fresh Right within 24 hours, giving it a 14-day shelf life. And to me, that's not only, and the debate continues as to whether or not we use soil, and we don't, but it is beyond organic, because under these conditions, and if you monitor these conditions, you can actually change the nature of those plants. You can put more spice into your rocket if that's what you need, by changing the color, the intensity, the pulse, the time. Or you can put vitamin C into your cress. And to me, that's the border between food and pharmaceutical. It's a nutraceutical, and I'm extremely excited by that, because I think it's going to change the world. Thank you, Patrick.
I'm now going to go to our next speaker, who is Liz Hosmer, who's the head of buying from Farmdrop. I'm glad you're here, and I'm glad Farmdrop are going to speak to us, because you'll have noticed that we haven't had a heavy focus on food companies and retailers, and they're not well represented here today. That doesn't mean to say that we may not return to this issue. We must, because the market's come up several times today, but I guess we couldn't cover everything. But we've got one case study here, a disruptive new company that has a new model, which includes, and these are my 3 questions to you, and I'm going to give you the floor. The question, can these new disruptive food models return more money to the farmer? That's one question. Secondly, can they be profitable? And thirdly, could they go to scale? So I'm hoping, Liz, that in your presentation you will cover those 3 questions, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Patrick. So Patrick has kind of already pointed this out, but I'm obviously not here as a scientist or a farmer or a policy expert, but I am sort of an online retail veteran, having been at Amazon for 10 years before joining Farmdrop. But what this means is that today, along with it at Groundswell last week, has been very, very eye-opening for me. And I'm really inspired by the amount of thought and passion going into this problem, and it gives me a lot of hope for the future to see all of you working so hard and using your very clever minds on this really important and pressing problem. So thank you, and thank you for letting me tag along. I also wanted to say I feel a little bit outgunned by some of the other panelists at this event, but I do hope that my different perspective makes up for this a little bit. So as Patrick said, I'm going to talk to you today about Farmdrop and how we're trying to make sustainable farming pay. And I'm going to do this not as an advert for Farmdrop, but as a case study about a retailer trying to solve this problem. And I will share some observations on some of the things we think are important to help make sustainable farming pay. And also I'll try to be really honest about the challenges that we face and the things we think are going well and the things that we haven't really figured out yet. I will also cover your 3 questions. So to start, let me tell you about Farmdrop. So we are an online supermarket, and what that means is you can go onto our website or our app, you can choose a 1-hour delivery slot, you can fill up your trolley, check out, and we will deliver the groceries to your house. And our customers are predominantly, so we're focused in London, and our customers are predominantly young professionals and young families in London. And we do see ourselves as a tech company. We are backed by a mixture of social impact investors and venture firms. And they support us because there's a growing awareness that sustainable food is the future of grocery. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to be the greenest and the healthiest online supermarket, and we want to really support sustainable farmers and bring their wonderful products to new customers, and we want to give customers access to those products. And we really do believe that customers want these products. Tom Watson's experience was a great example, actually, of how people are thinking differently about how they eat. So people are ditching sugary breakfast cereals. They're eating more eggs, and egg sales in the UK have gone up 20% in the last 2 years. The number of farm shops have trebled since 2004, and on our own website we see that when we have an organic and a non-organic version of the same product, even though the organic products command a price premium, they outsell the non-organic products by 39%, and that's kind of across a basket of goods. And I think because of that last data point, we think that certification really matters. So I think this is something we have been talking about at this event, but customers are really obsessed with organic, even though they may not really understand what it means. And I think that as a retailer trying to navigate what certification should we be having, how do we evaluate someone who doesn't have any certification? I think we really need help from this group, and especially from Patrick and his team, to try to find a better way of doing this. So we look forward to seeing you succeed on your quest to build and implement something that works better and is easier for everyone to navigate. So I think the other side of making sustainable farming pay is making it really convenient for customers to shop for these products. If you ask people on the street, and stop people on the street and say, hey, do you want to buy more sustainable food? They'll say, yeah, absolutely, and then they'll go back to their local Tesco because it's close, or they'll do their online grocery shop with whoever they're doing it with because it's easy, they have the app, they know it works, and it's just so convenient. And if you want customers to change their behavior, you have to bring it to them, and you have to make it really, really convenient. And we see this in the online grocery segment and in online retail in general. Nearly 2/3 of UK online retailers offer next day delivery, and 80% of them say that they want to do it faster than that. And several major supermarkets, as well as Amazon through Prime Now, are doing same day grocery delivery now. And a few of them have been doing this for a few years now. So like it or not, I think the customer expectations are getting higher and higher for how convenient this needs to be. So I think that if we don't make it as convenient as it is for customers with whoever they're shopping with now, we're not going to succeed. So that's something Farmdrop are really trying to nail. I think we're getting close. So that's encouraging to see, and customers are responding well to it. So I think the summary here is two things that I think we can do better and that are really important are certification and convenience. So now I'm going to address Patrick's 3 questions. So what are we paying our farmers, and how do we make sure that we're paying them more? So this is a central tenet and principle for Farmdrop. And what we try to do is we try to use technology to simplify that supply chain and take a lot of the cost out and take a lot of the waste out. And so if you can do that, you can afford to pay farmers more, and we also approach it in a different way. It's a conversation. It's not us going to them and saying, this is what we pay, take it or leave it. It's a conversation. We understand, what does it cost them to produce these things in this way? What does it cost them to get their product to us? Because that may be causing them, or they may need to do some things a little bit differently. For instance, some of the meat providers we work with, they might not have been previously processing and packing it for retail. So they have to figure that out, and obviously that incurs an additional cost for them. So it's a conversation, and it's something that we agree together, what we both think is fair. Number 2, are we profitable? Patrick gets right to the heart of the matter, doesn't he? So on a gross margin basis, so for the cost of goods and small line items, processing and stuff, absolutely. When you add in the variable cost to pick, pack, and deliver an order, we're really, really, really close. And when you add in the fixed cost and the people, that's a little bit further away. And by fixed costs, I mean our warehouse, basically, and obviously our tech team and all the staff that we employ. That's a little bit further away. However, we do believe we can get there. We think we can get there in 2 years' time. And we think we can get there by doing 2 things. 1, increasing the amount the customers spend in each shop. So obviously that helps with the cost to deliver it to someone if they buy more stuff. On a relative basis, it's cheaper. And also, when we grow orders, we spread those fixed costs of the warehouse and the people across more orders. So we're really confident, and we think we're on the right track, and we know exactly what we need to do to get there. And actually, the third question, which you didn't mention just now, but I want to comment on, is how do we make sustainable food less expensive? Can I comment on that one? Yeah?
It's related to going to scale too, isn't it? Probably.
Yeah, it is. So this is hard, and there's been a lot of talk about this today and yesterday, and I think it's something our founders absolutely aspired to do when they started Farmdrop, but we haven't nailed this yet. We haven't figured this out yet. But I think the best thing we can do as a retailer is continue to take waste out of the supply chain to bring our costs down. And I think we need to continue educating consumers about why this product is amazing. And we do that through the content on our website and on our app. And I think by helping consumers understand why these products matter, it's a little bit of a cop-out answer, because that doesn't actually bring the price down. But I think we have to start by at least helping people understand why it's amazing, why it's an amazing product, and telling the story. You know, we sell everything as under the name of the producer, and we have pictures of them on our websites, and we do videos, and we really tell the story of what they're doing and why it's amazing. And I think that's really an important step. I know that doesn't solve it, but I think that's a really important step. But the affordability issue is definitely the trickiest challenge for us. And as we've heard today, it's complex. It's something we have to tackle together. There's a policy angle as well. And I'm glad that we're coming together to discuss. So that's me.
That's perfect.
Thank you.
So, Dieter, how can you help Tony and us clarify this question of how we can use the policy framework to shift the balance of economic advantage to sustainable and climate-friendly farming and food systems.
Thank you very much. You asked me last night to talk on net zero this morning, which I was happy to do so. Net zero and carbon is just one parcel or package in the total framework in which we need to look at farming. And I do worry that it might become the only part of the package we look at. What I'd like to do very briefly this afternoon is to talk about making sustainable farming pay. I'm an economist, so the dirty bit about the money is something that comes naturally to me, but it's pretty obvious, and should be pretty obvious, that none of this works as simply a green and pleasant land. And the reason I called my book Green and Prosperous Land is we have to have a prosperous agricultural sector, and we have to have a green environment. And frankly, and I think it's now a really big turning point in this whole debate, we don't have either. The current model is broken, and everybody seems to now accept that, which is a huge achievement. It doesn't deliver biodiversity. In fact, it's delivered the opposite. It doesn't deliver carbon neutrality. It produces lots of emissions. It's not very profitable for the vast bulk of farmers. Despite the 2 pages in Farmers Weekly a couple of years ago trying to prove me wrong on this point, the land prices are grossly inflated by the basic farm payment, and land prices are far too high for the agricultural sector to sustain itself, and land prices are falling, contrary to the 2 pages in Farmers Weekly to the contrary. It doesn't produce cheap food. It does not handle waste well. It produces a lot of waste, including a hell of a lot of food waste. And we've got a population with a serious obesity problem, and we've got mental health and other issues too. And it's really important to recognize these things, because if you recognize the model is broken, you have the foundation to sort out what a sustainable farming model would look like. And what I'd like to do is to take you through very quickly what I consider to be the key questions in order to formulate an answer to the question of what a future sustainable and therefore profitable farming industry might look like. The first point is to be absolutely clear about the principles. What is it that you actually want the agricultural sector to deliver? And what principles underlie how that should be delivered in order that we can have that sustainable future? It's crucial to talk about the money. Where is the money actually going to come from? And for those people who are so keen to vote for Brexit, how exactly is the money going to be maintained once the Treasury is in charge of the subsidies and not Brussels, the Commission and the European Union? And which forms of money will flow? What policies are there to deliver it? And will they be credible? And therefore, what does this bright future look like? So, let's start with something which you might call kind of 101 economics. And take a look at a bit of farming, field like this, and ask yourself, what would it be like if it really was a sustainable industry? What would be true? And in some sense, it's pretty simple. All the costs associated with producing food would be included, not only in the costs to the farmer, but in the prices consumers pay. Because ultimately, pollution caused by farmers is pollution caused by us consumers who buy the products that farmers produce. Business doesn't actually pollute. We, the consumers, pollute, and business does the pollution on our behalf. It's a great illusion to think, sort out industry, sort out the farmers, and we'll be all fine, as if it's not our fault. I asked some students a week ago to go away and do a one-day carbon diary, to write down from the moment they got up in the morning all the carbon they consumed in the day. And they all failed at the first hurdle, which is when they go to the loo first time in the morning, who pays for the water, what's the carbon involved in it, where's the loo paper come from, before they got to the breakfast and all the other components. We have to get away from the idea producers cause ultimately pollution. We do. So all those costs have to be included. And if you don't include them, then you won't have a sustainable outcome. And you can't get away from that. You can pretend we want cheap food, cheap energy, cheap everything else, and we can have all those things, but you can't have a sustainable environment as a result. You can't have both the cake and eat it, to quote one of our potential future prime ministers. The second thing is that all the benefits have to be paid for. When farmers do things which have benefits to us, both in producing food, but all the other stuff that we value from our land, that make it green and pleasant, they should be paid for them. And if they're not paid for them, it's highly unlikely that they're going to produce them. Farming may be, for some people, a charitable activity, but you can't base a sustainable farming industry on charity. So people have to be paid, and they have to be paid properly and appropriately. Otherwise, you won't get the public goods. And if you don't want to pay for them, don't expect to get them. You can't have both. Cake and eat it doesn't work here either, Boris. The next thing is that a normal farming sector would pay the same taxes and the same structure of general taxes as everyone else. You can't have cheap red diesel and pretend you're going to have net zero in 2040. You've got to be against cheap red diesel. You've got to be in favour of a common price for fuel. Not palatable, an expense to lots of people here in addition to what their expenses already are. But again, you can't have your cake and eat it. Cheap diesel and paid for carbon sequestration. You have to do both. And in this world, if all the costs and all the benefits were included, then we should have a farming sector where the land values correctly return on the revenues, a reasonable, normal profit. I recently tried to buy a farm in Exmoor in some of the most marginal land in Exmoor, and they wanted £5,000 an acre. How do you possibly, even if you incorporate all the costs and benefits, get to £5,000 an acre? Well, I think the answer is you have a pheasant shoot with 600 to 700 birds a day. But the reality is that the farm asset value is the base on which you work out the rate of return after you've incorporated all the costs and the benefits. So that's what a normal industry would look like. Sounds easy, but then you have to work through the detail. And the detail starts from 3 core principles, which are now explicit in public, either legislation going through Parliament or actual legislation. The first one is public money for public goods. And from a point at the beginning of this debate, when people thought this was a ridiculous idea of environmental enthusiasts, I got accused on Farming Today of talking about a sort of idyllic Enid Blyton world when I was talking about public goods for public money a couple of years ago or so. Now everyone accepts it. They understand the principle that we, the public, should not pay farmers for private goods, we should pay for public goods. The trouble is that everybody wants to get their own particular interest called a public good in order to, if I put it unfairly, make sure that their particular lobby interest subsidy gets paid for. And so we have the chairman of the select committee overseeing DEFRA, a farmer, and I think an NFU member overseeing the regime which pays the subsidies, etc. It's questionable in its own right, asking the Prime Minister in the House of Commons, does the Prime Minister agree that food is a public good? Well, no, it isn't. It's a private good. The difference between public goods and private goods is very clear. There are lots of things in the public interest which are not public goods, but you may want to intervene support. So security, food security, may well be in the public interest, but it's not a public good. And you need to be absolutely clear what is and what isn't a public good before you start bidding for the subsidies that go with this. So some things are and some things aren't. It's not comprehensive and universal of all the supports that there ought to be and all the interventions by a long way. We might want strategic stockpiles if we're interested in military defence. We might want cyber security. There's all sorts of stuff we might want, but these things are not within the category. The second principle is the polluter pays. And if you really put polluter pays principle and sequestration and other subsidies into place, it would be the most radical thing you would ever do to British agriculture, because it's the one sector of the economy where the polluted pay. And if you think it through, and many of you in this audience are people who are not involved in high polluting activities, in fact many of you are engaged in very low pollution activities, the unlevel playing field I spoke to this morning is precisely because some forms of agriculture which have very serious pollution consequences are not paying the full price, especially when it comes to things like fertilizers, pesticides and other carbon emissions. The third one, and there's a spelling mistake on this slide, which people don't seem to mention, is net environmental gain. And this is a potentially very substantial source of revenue for farmers. So if you carry out a development, you build some of the 3 million further houses we're building, and you cement over or concrete over bits of landscape which has biodiversity, etc., upon it, you should not be allowed to damage the environment without paying for the consequences of damage you cause. Net environmental gain is just basically an extension of the polluter pays principle. So you should have to pay compensation. You should have to improve the natural environment somewhere else for the damage you've done in the particular area. And there's going to be a lot of damage because there's going to be a lot of development with 10 million more people in this country. So where that money's spent is absolutely crucial. Some polluters, carbon emitters like, say, Shell or BP or many other hydrocarbon companies, will want to make their payments for the damage they cause by paying estates to plant trees, by buying carbon credits off you, by paying you for sequestrating carbon in the soils. This is all part of the trading which relates to what we're doing to the economy as a whole and provides significant potential revenue flows, which I'll turn to. And of course, all of this has to be done in the frame of the precautionary principle, which is an incredibly important principle. We can't live in a world where people say, you know, there's no scientific proof that DDT is bad, so we'll go on using it because we rely on the best science until we find out what happens. And we go through one after these after another in which we apply a particular chemical to the land or a particular technique and we say there's no proof yet that it's terrible. I don't want to get in the glyphosate debate, but I would want to say one thing. You won't know for 10, 15, 20 years' time what the consequences of this chemical are on the environment. And that consideration, the uncertainty, should be borne in mind when we look at these. So these are the four principles. And they are now going to be enshrined in the Environment Bill and the Agricultural Bill and the Planning Law. This is a revolution in the making, and there is no going back from this. There is no retreat. Now, how can this be delivered? It's all very well to have a clear idea of what you want to achieve, and that's a real breakthrough. To actually know what you want from your agricultural sector. It's very important to know what principles you're going to apply, but it's all meaningless political mumbo-jumbo until it gets turned into actual policy on the ground and money in the pockets of those who manage our land. So there's no lack of new legal changes to the framework in which you act. The Agricultural Bill is as important as the joining bill to the Common Agricultural Policy in the EU in 72, 73, 74, and the 1947 Act. It's that important. It's that big a break. It's the once in 40, 50 years transitions in policy. So it's not a minor piece of legislation. This is foundational, and it is well established within the Commons. It may take a lot longer. We may have a general election in the autumn and all that kind of mumbo-jumbo, but this thing is on its way. The Environment Bill is already out there in draft. The revised version was supposed to be out in May before the next part of the Brexit shenanigans started, but it's well on its way. And at the heart, it has the placing of the 25-year Environment Plan on a statutory basis. Climate Change Act is on a statutory basis, and that's why it has cutting power. It will be statutory that the government achieves the 10 goals under the 25-year plan. And if your bedtime reading doesn't stretch to the 25-year Environment Plan, you're able to get to sleep relatively easy. In other words, you should have a look at what the 10 goals are and relate them to the public goods you think you're going to get paid for. They're not a direct read across, but it's pretty damn good. And there is huge cross-party support for this bit, even more than there is for the agricultural bill. This morning you may have twitched that you ought to think a lot more about energy and a lot more about carbon, in addition to the standard agricultural policies. There is an energy bill drafted, ready to go. There's an energy white paper ready to go, and was caught up in May in the Brexit shenanigans. That builds on the cost of energy review, which I had the privilege of carrying out for the government. It's an independent review last autumn, which has a lot about agriculture, a lot about the framework of the determination of agricultural markets, within which many of the AD and other energy schemes that are now part and parcel of most farmers' packages are set. You need to know about that. That's going to be part of the framework when you operate. In addition, net zero is now in law, subject to a 5-year review. Net gain is going into law as net biodiversity gain in the first instance, with an intention to go on in the law to net environmental gain. And all of this is designed to provide the framework, the policies, to deliver on the principles, to deliver that overall objective of having a better natural environment for the next generation than the current one, and within that, making sure that we have a world in which farming can genuinely be sustainable. So where does the money come from? Now here there is good and bad news. There are really 3 sets of monies from outside, in addition to the revenue from the selling of the stuff that farmers actually grow, produce, and take to market. Remember, this is a £9 billion industry, 0.7% of GDP. So that's why the numbers are all quite small. But the good news is, because it's relatively small, the numbers, you don't need much change in the numbers to make a significant improvement. If you want to build a new HS2, you need 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 billion. Subsidising agriculture is 3 at the moment in its pure form. So small changes in numbers can have a big effect, negatively and positively. The first bit is the 3 billion, the CAP money, of which 2 billion is the basic farm payment. So the question isn't whether you're going to get the basic farm payment. You're not. It has no future apart from transition. You might be able to drag out the transition, but being paid for owning land is something which does not stand up to public inspection. Many people understand how we got there for perfectly reasonable, understandable reasons, but to put it bluntly, we, the general taxpayer, want something for our money. We want you to do things in exchange for which you're going to get the money. The question is, are you going to get 3 billion going forward? Well, I did a presentation just after the referendum to the Southwest Upland farmers in the NFU headquarters in Exeter. It was very kind of the NFU to ask me along. And I started off by saying, you guys all voted for Brexit. Why? And an elderly Dartmoor farmer leant forward in the front row and said, don't you worry, boy, something will come up. To which my reply is, yes, HM Treasury. Okay? So now the 3 billion is not a number that comes out of EU discussions. It's a number that comes out of the Treasury's public expenditures reviews when compared with health and everything else. And if I was a farmer, this was one of the two things that would frighten me most about Brexit. It pales into insignificance to what's going to go on the tariffs and the so-called free trade deals, which are anything but free trade and unlikely to be starting with the interests of a sustainable farming industry. And as the EU demonstrated, the car industry and other industries are regarded as more important. So you have to justify 3 billion. And you have to show why it's in the public interest as good public expenditure to spend that 3 billion, because we're going to get a cost-benefit ratio way above that. The good news is, I don't doubt you can do that. If we cannot get public benefit, given the health issues, the obesity issues, the environmental issues, the biodiversity issues, if you can't get more than 3 billion of benefits from that expenditure, or if you can find any other public expenditure which yields better returns, good luck to you. But this isn't a case that's going to go nem con. This is a case you're going to have to make it. And there is a real risk when we have two prime ministerial candidates bidding with each other to both offer large tax cuts and huge increases in public expenditure, that when that lot's paid for, everything else gets sliced. And if I was running Tony's outfit, this would be something that would keep me awake at night as to how this can be properly justified. And the industry, when someone asked me the question about us this morning, the industry has to get behind why this is good spending of public money for good public benefits. Now, the second thing is you're going to get some carbon payments. And it's not hard to work this out. 16, 18 pound a tonne. You work out how much you're going to sequester. I'll come on to a little, if I've got a moment, to just say how you might do that. It's very practical, very doable. But if you're emitting carbon, you're going to have to pay the tax. And other people who are causing emissions of carbon are going to want to buy credits from you. So it's not just the government's going to pay you for sequestering carbon, that somehow we're going to get a subsidy for it. Go and find a polluter who wants to buy the credits for you. Go and have a look at the emissions trading scheme in Europe. Think about the big companies that want to buy afforestation. Shell, for example, is going for a global scale reforestation to try to offset its emissions. I'm not sure it's credible, but I'm sure as hell they're going to buy the credits. So if we're going to have 20% of the country covered in trees, hopefully the right trees, the revenue stream is apparent. And the question is, where does the money go? Does it go straight to the Treasury? Or does it get recycled within carbon abatement and other measures? All to play for, lots and lots of money involved. And then there's the net biodiversity, net environmental gain money. Where to go? Now, in my book, I set out how one should construct something that looks like a sovereign wealth fund, a nature fund, in which these revenues should go together and form part of the bucket, which then goes for people to bid for the public goods and public benefits. And then on top of that is the private income of farming, when farmers are paid properly for what they produce, when supermarkets are behaving competitively rather than monopolistically, and when consumers value the end product that's produced. And that's it. That's the lot. That's what the money's about. And the question is, does that add up to enough to make a profitable farming sector? If it doesn't, the farming sector would have to contract. But if it does, and it should, then it will produce an outcome which finances sustainable farming, subject to, and I'm making this very sketchy, to the right tariff structure, to the right treatment of imports versus domestic production, to the other level playing field arguments that need to be put in place. And if they're not put in place, then something else has to come on top of it. So just to summarize, what this revolution is about, and I do think it's like 1947 and 1973, is a fundamental structural change in farming. It's a huge opportunity. Of course, it has its risks. And basically, this is moving from the world we all understand, which is the cap with its basic farm payments and the tariffs which keep the food prices up in Britain, the inflated land prices, which produce 5,000 an acre in Exmoor and make it impossible for anyone to make a farming business out of much of our land, and make the EU have to now subsidise new young farmers to get in because they can't get through the higher prices caused by the basic farm payment. You just couldn't make this stuff up. All of that's going, and possibly the tariffs. And the brown environment, which has been getting browner and browner, that huge loss of insect life, biodiversity. Anyone who has as many grey hairs as me can remember an environment which was different from this, and the statistics show that it's different from this. That is being replaced by elms, and elms for public goods, and the payments for those public goods, and the penalties for the pollution that's caused. We have to have a new set of trading arrangements. That's absolutely critical. And then we have a normalisation of land prices, taxes and values. If you own a lot of land and you borrow a lot of money from the bank to pay £10,000 an acre, well, maybe you might start worrying. Because the regime that produced those outcomes shouldn't and won't produce those outcomes into the future. And this is a world which is perfectly plausible to get out of the apartheid between the sustainable farming businesses and the intensive businesses, between the intensive bits of agriculture and farms and the set-aside nice environmental bits on the side, and creates a much more holistic, sustainable framework. And I just want to echo in conclusion one final point which Richard made. This is all in the context of massive, massive technical change. The point about insects, in a small number of factories, you can produce more protein than the entire beef and sheep industry in Britain. You really got to get a grip of the scale of what Richard was pointing to, of what's coming. Robotics transform the way farming happens. It's happening all around that change, the digitalization of virtually everything. And that has one final thing. We now have the capacity to do the natural capital baselines, to use the satellite data, to use the data on the ground, to create baselines, to measure exactly the public goods that are being added, particularly carbon, to model what enhanced public goods would look like, and that's all to facilitate farmers being the people who identify, with help of course, what public goods they want to bid for in order to get the greatest public bucks we can get for the amount of money that the taxpayer is going to put in the future. Do this lot and you will have a sustainable farming future. Try to go back to what we've had in the past, and I'm afraid it's very bad news for farmers, their businesses, their profit line, their mortgages, and their exposure to the land prices and the land banks. So you can do this. It's doable. We can measure these components. We can sort out the revenue flows. This is not rocket science. This is all doable. But if we choose not to do it, not to take carbon consumption into account as well as carbon production, not to do the tariffs properly, not to put British farming on a level playing field, not to price carbon properly, not to do the public goods in a focused way, not to involve farmers doing that, then, hey, well, don't go and tell us you're going to create a green and pleasant or prosperous land, because you're not. You can't have your cake and eat it. If you want your cake, we have to embrace this new framework and take it forward. I think it's really optimistic and really doable, but it won't happen overnight, and it requires a lot of detailed work, engagement, and all of the farming community understanding that natural capital is the core of their private business as well as their public business. So I hope in 5 or 10 years' time, this will all be NEMCON, and if I was to say these things then, you'd all think that's terribly boring, can't we get some more interesting people along? Thank you very much.